I'm going to be making the claim specifically that atheism, or naturalism, provides a better account for three facts of our universe. The first being the hiddenness of God. The second being the geographical, statistical arrangement, shall we say, of religious belief. And the third will be the problem of gratuitous suffering, and we'll see if we get time to finish it off.
The gauntlet has been thrown. My name is Nate Williams, the director of the Apologetics Resource Center, and we're going to break down and attempt to answer Alex's three arguments over two videos. This video, part one, will cover the first two arguments of divine hiddenness and the argument from geography or statistics, population percentages. In the next video, part two, we'll cover that last argument on suffering, gratuitous suffering, as Alex will describe it. Let's move to argument number one. But before we begin, however, I want to compliment Alex O'Connor. As I've watched him through the years, and I've listened to many of his debates, he's debated a lot of my favorite apologists, my favorite theologians. Super sharp. Alex is one of the most talented debaters I've ever seen, I've ever listened to. And so that's a compliment. He speaks well. He is not abrasive or ugly. He's not inflammatory as some other debaters are on either side, whether atheist or theist, atheist or Christian. And so again, I think Alex is phenomenally skilled in debate. And then I would also say from the atheistic standpoint, I think he is the best atheist debater I've ever watched. So again, Alex, all the props to you and your skill in this practice of debate. Let's move to argument number one and about divine hiddenness and Alex's version of divine hiddenness, the non-resistant non-believer. Here is how Alex describes this individual and this argument.
There are, however, also people who disbelieve in God, not out of resistance or stubbornness or a hardened heart, but rather due to sheer lack of conviction. Indeed, many such people actively want to be convinced of God's existence and would jump at the chance of entering into a relationship with him if they thought that he did. But no matter how hard they search, they simply find no answer forthcoming from the heavens, and this is the non-resistant non-believer. Formally, then, Schellenberg's problem of divine hiddenness can be stated as follows. Premise one, if there is a God, he is perfectly loving, something I'm pretty sure Jonathan agrees with. Premise two, if a perfectly loving God exists, non-resistant non-belief does not occur. Premise 3, non-resistant non-belief does occur. 4, therefore, no perfectly loving God exists. And the conclusion from the first premise is that therefore there is no God.
I want to repeat the argument outlined by Alex just so that when I talk about line 3 or premise 3 about non-resistant non-belief, you have it clear in your mind what Alex is talking about. So in argument form, this is the version of divine hiddenness that Alex goes with. If there is a God, he is perfectly loving. If a perfectly loving God exists, non-resistant non-belief would not occur. There would not be non-resistant non-believers. Line 3, or premise 3, this is the one that we're going to have a problem with and the one we're going to pinpoint, the weakest line for me. Non-resistant non-belief does occur. There are non-resistant non-believers. Therefore, no perfectly loving God exists, and therefore, there is no God. So roughly, that is the argument outlined by Alex. I'm going to answer this argument in two ways, and then this segment of the video dealing with argument number one, I'm going to finish this segment in a personal, pastoral kind of relational note. So this is for if you have friends who are going through this, and what might you say to them? The weakest part of this argument, so this is part one, it's outlined in premise number 3. Non-resistant non-belief, that's what you focus on. And for the sake of debate, that is where you attack that line. This is not verifiable, the fact of non-resistant non-belief. And in fact, Alex does admit this later on, just a little bit later on. He talks about how you can't confirm someone's internal emotional mental state, what's in their mind, what's in their heart. He tries to cover this up, this self-defeating admission, and he goes through a rhetorical, I'll play it for you in just a moment. He goes through his story and all that he's done to convince you that he is a non-resistant non-believer. But for the sake of debate, where you're not just debating the person across from you, you're also trying to reach the crowd and persuade the crowd of onlookers. That's who you're talking to in a debate audience. You don't grant premise three or line three, and that cannot be washed away in a flourish of rhetorical skill. Alex tries to do it, even though he admits the fault in the reasoning, the non-verifiability of line three. He tries to wash that away by sharing his story to convince you that he's a non-resistant non-believer. Do not grant it. Do not grant it. I cannot verify in a debate that you are sincere or genuine. That's not my job. I don't know your heart. I don't know your mind. I can only deal with facts and arguments. So in this debate, if I was the person across, so in this case, Jonathan McClatchy, the other debater, I will not concede non-resistant non-belief because I can't prove how someone genuinely feels or thinks, no matter how hard they protest. So, for the sake of the debate, I do not grant premise three, and thus the whole argument falls apart. That is part one of my answer to argument one. So, we're going to now move on to part two, the second half of my answer to argument one. But first, let me play for you, as I said before, Alex's very good, very persuasive attempt to convince you of his non-resistant non-belief. Here it is.
Of course, you cannot know my heart. You can't know if I'm truly as non-resistant as I claim, but I hope that my actions here might betray me. As a Catholic child, I was once an altar boy. I would serve the altar of Mother Church every Sunday, dressed in a white robe. In the time since then, I have, to put it mildly, been looking for God. I went to Catholic schools. I studied philosophy and theology at A-levels. I made a career out of engaging with religious arguments. I have explored arguments from contingency, from fine-tuning, from motion, from mathematics, from irreducible complexity and the alleged resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. It may surprise my followers online to learn that at university I visited numerous churches on the invitation of various friends. I spent hours talking with religious friends until the sun rose again, if you like. I attended Bible groups regularly too, which might surprise people as well. And in fact, I still do attend such groups. Just recently, I agreed to embark on a series of study of the wisdom literature, specifically reading it again in the hopes that this time I might finally feel a divine presence seeping from between the lines. I moved into a house for a year with two devoutly Christian housemates, with the express intention of seeing if the obvious truth of Christianity and theism that people like to talk about can be found in the minutiae of daily life. I have looked, in other words, in a great deal of places. I read Athanasius and Anselm. I read Augustine and Aquinas. I looked in Julian of Norwich and Catherine of Siena. I looked at the sociological origin of religious belief in Durkheim and Marx and Freud and Young. I looked at religious experience in William James and Rudolf Otto. I've looked in the modern works of people like Ed Feser and Bill Craig and Michael Murray and Richard Swinburne and Alvin Plantinga. I have looked in poetry. I've looked in the Psalms. I've looked in Job. I've looked in Ecclesiastes. I've looked in Dostoevsky. I read C.S. Lewis. I listened to worship music. I prayed. I studied the gospel. I even got an actual degree in theology from a university. And nothing.
Again, Alex, you can protest all you want. For the sake of the debate, I'm not granting you non-resistant non-belief because I can't enter into your heart and your mind. I can't confirm these things. They're not verifiable. Lots of people study lots of different things for lots of different reasons. That is subjective. But also, the second issue with the non-resistant non-belief argument is that a personal and subjective and feelings-based argument can be canceled out, think about a math equation, can be canceled out by someone else who comes to the opposite conclusion. So, for example, imagine I am the anti-Alex. I've studied and I've read many authors. I've studied the original languages, Greek and Hebrew in seminary. I had to take 2 years of both. I have a degree in theology from a seminary. I've prayed, I've read my Bible, I've been a part of Bible study groups and Sunday school classes. I've gone on retreats, so on and so forth. And guess what? In my personal and subjective experience, I see God everywhere. I see God in nature. I see God in DNA. I see his handiwork all across creation, in the stars, in Jesus Christ of Nazareth, and the Gospels. The problem with a subjective argument based upon one man's experiences is that they can be neutralized and canceled out by a subjective argument from someone else's experiences. So, like I said, I am the anti-Alex to this argument. And like a math equation, we cancel each other out. He's come to one conclusion, I've come to another. Thus, argument number one, it's finished. It falls apart. It doesn't work for that reason as well, the cancellation. But one thing I want to know when it comes to debate, I've said that line for the sake of debate. In a debate, you have your opponent. So in this video, as I mentioned before, this video comes from the context of his debate with Jonathan McClatchy, and it happened a few years ago. And yes, you are debating the other person. You can find all these links down below to the original debate and then to this specific video I'm responding to. I'm not responding to any other part of the debate. Yes, you have the debater you're facing, and you would like to persuade them, but oftentimes that's just not going to happen. Instead, the people you're really trying to convince the audience, the people who are there. So your tactics are going to change. The way you inflect your voice, maybe how strongly you respond. You're doing it for their benefit because you want to try to persuade them for the sake of debate. However, again, finishing my segment on argument number one on a pastoral, personal, relational note, you're going to run into friends who have some version of the divine hiddenness argument that Alex outlines. His version is a non-resistant non-believer. There are other versions as well. And they're going to wonder, where is God? I don't feel his presence. I don't see him in nature. I see a lot of human suffering and all that. And they're going to ask you questions. Well, if you're talking to a friend, your response might be a little different than if you're in the midst of a debate. I'd encourage you to listen. I'd encourage you to pray. I'd encourage you to sit in silence with them and walk with them because for many people, it might be deeply personal and maybe a little hurtful. They've prayed and they just haven't felt that God's responded. Whether or not he has or what that looks like, you could get into some of that. Well, what sign are you looking for? What would persuade you? Those are valid questions. But the bigger thing is to walk with them through the season of life because seasons change. Their perspective might change. They might go through losses that will change the way they look at life and so on and so forth. And so your goal there is to deepen the friendship. And so whether or not that means arguing with them, sometimes that's not very effective. You might want to draw them into the Christian story to tell them about Jesus and what he's done for us and how Jesus understands what we're going through, the loneliness and the pain. And Jesus was betrayed by his friends and so on and so forth. Jesus, as Hebrews 4 outlines, Jesus understands what we're going through. You might want to show the beauty of the Christian story, the beauty of the music that Christians have produced and the media, the art, the pictures and the paintings. You might want to show the goodness of Christianity through all that the church has done to help society, for all the foibles and the mistakes, all the service organizations and all the ways that Christian ministries have helped people. You might want to talk a little bit about that too, that Christians have been a major source for good in society, so on and so forth. But on a pastoral and a personal note, you might not want to argue with them if you don't sense that's the right move. However, be there for them and listen to them. The psalmist talks about this as well. Sometimes it's funny enough, if you go back and you watch the whole of this clip, Alex does mention a psalm and he walks through that. But another thing about the Psalms is they do talk about the loneliness that David feels and the psalmists feel, where they couldn't feel God's presence. They didn't see what God was doing, and yet they trusted that God would see them through. And so for the Christian, we look to Christ and the cross as our hope and our joy. So you would want to share that with your friend as they're working through this season of life.
As I'm editing this video, I wanted to add another section to the pastoral part, and it's this. If Christianity is true, our version of theism is true, then it also means God knows the future. And something else you might want to add is that maybe God has withheld himself from Alex because he wants to do something 10, 20, 30 years later. We just don't know what that is quite yet. And so there is the factor of God's timing and God's plan. And so sometimes we look back, I think about my life 10, 15, 20 years ago, and I see how God was moving in ways I didn't see at the time. So I'd also add some of that in my response if I was in more of a friendship situation with Alex. Hey, sometimes we see things clearly in the past and we don't know what God is doing or will do as well. So just another thing to add to this.
Okay. So again, that was argument number one, the divine hiddenness of God. I worked through two parts of the answer, why it fails, why it doesn't work for the sake of the debate. And then also I finished on a pastoral note. Now we're going to go to argument number two, and the argument from geography or population percentages, however you want to phrase it. But again, here is Alex's description of the argument.
Not only does theism need to account for non-resistant non-belief, but also for the fact that such belief is unequally present across the globe. Stephen Mason has pointed out that the populace of Saudi Arabia is 95% Muslim and therefore 95% theistic, whereas the populace of Thailand is 95% Buddhist and therefore, at best, 5% theistic. How likely you are to be a theist, in other words, is intimately tied to the place in which you happen to be born. What can better explain this geographical spread? Theism or naturalism or atheism?
Again, like with the first argument, I'll answer this one in two parts, part A, part B. The first part is this. This argument is more of an observation. It's more of a sociological observation than an argument proper. It doesn't deal with any of Christianity's truth claims, such as the empty tomb, the truthfulness of the Bible, so on and so forth, the existence of God. It doesn't seek to answer Christianity's questions or refute Christianity's arguments. So the thought that, oh, if you're in a Christian nation with a lot of Christians, you have a higher likelihood of becoming a Christian, that's just a basic observation. God moves through human means. That just makes sense. That's just how basic things work. And that doesn't mean that Christianity's false. It's just a sociological observation. Yes, if you're around people who believe a certain thing, it is more likely that you will believe that thing. But that doesn't make that thing true or false itself. It's just, again, an observation. So it's not very strong as an argument proper. That's part one. Part two is this. While it makes sense in modern times with Christianity being such a large religion, again, it's around 2 billion people, give or take. It depends on how you quantify these things, how you measure these things. Christianity is a major religion nowadays. And so you use this observation that, hey, if you have a high percentage of Christians in a nation, it is more likely that you are a Christian. It works there. But where it falls apart is that you have to use, to be consistent, you have to use that type of reasoning to explain Christianity's initial growth, and you won't be able to. There was a time when Christianity was 0% of the world's population. Alex would have to explain, using his own reasoning outlined in this argument, how Christianity took over the Roman Empire without force in the face of sporadic and sometimes intense persecution. He would have to explain why Jesus, with no institutional power, he was a nomadic, traveling rabbi. He wasn't a general, he wasn't a king, he wasn't a prince. He had no institutional power, along with his 12 disciples, who again were poor and nomadic. All right, Alex, using your own reasoning, explain Christianity's explosive growth without force. That's to be contrasted with Islam, who grew through the sword, and Judaism, which grew through, let me correct myself. Judaism has not grown. It's always been a relatively small religion. So again, Alex, explain the growth using this same type of sociological reasoning. No institutional power. The population percentages were quite low. At one point, it was 0%. Explain all of that. It's easier to use that argument now that Christianity is a massive religion. My challenge to you is to try to use that argument when Christianity was a couple hundred people, when it was 500 people, when it was 3,000 people. It doesn't work. Again, something else is happening, but that reasoning fails. All right, y'all, I have answered argument number 1, divine hiddenness, and argument number 2, the argument from geography and population percentages. We're going to answer argument number 3 about suffering in part 2 of this series, part 1, part 2. That will come a little bit later. I'd love to know your thoughts. What do I get wrong? How would you answer? If you're a Christian, how would you answer? If you're not a Christian or you're not a theist, where do I stray? Where's the fault in my logic and my reasoning and my argumentation? I would love to know. You can comment down below. Again, the links are in the descriptions. You're going to see the overall debate between Alex O'Connor, Jonathan McClatchy, and then this specific clip that I'm responding to. I want to repeat, I'm not responding to the whole debate. I'm responding to this one video that came later. This is why I don't believe in God, from Alex O'Connor, where he opens up with his 3 arguments. I'd love to know how you would respond. But anyways, if you'd like to support ARC, I'll put a link down below. I'd love to travel, preach, and teach on all these topics. I'd love to answer questions and arguments from atheism, Islam, other religions, other worldviews, and your financial support would help me to do so. Again, the link is down below. Please like, share, and subscribe so that you can stay updated on the ministry and you can see the videos when they come out and I post them. But until next time, y'all, take care. I'll talk with you later.